Today's platform is What's Ethical About Humor? With leader Anne Klaeysen. Anne Klaeysen is a leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture. She holds a Doctor of Ministry degree in Pastoral Counseling from Hebrew Union College, as well as master's degrees in German from the State University of New York at Albany, and Business Administration from New York University. Anne is the Ethical Humanist Religious Life Advisor at Columbia University and Humanist Chaplain at NYU. She also participates in several interfaith social justice coalitions. And on a personal note, she can tell a mean joke. Please welcome Anne Klaeysen.
Yeah, but see, now the expectation is too high, although that does lead into one of the theories of incongruity. Let me get this light on here. Great, okay.
You want to lower it?
I think I do, actually. Thank you.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah. Ta-da! Magic! It's magic. Okay, great. Good morning.
Good morning.
And happy April Fool's Day. I have to admit, I never liked April Fool's Day because I was anxious that I wouldn't get the joke or I would be the victim of a candid camera type prank. You've heard the saying, if you slip on a banana, it's comedy. If I slip, it's tragedy. Well, for years, I've been wanting to give a platform on humor, and I kept a file just waiting for the right time. What could be better than April Fool's Day? And today is also Easter. So those of you who engage on social media, and I already checked in with Bonnie, so I know she saw it. Did you see the picture of Sigmund Freud sitting with paper and pen in hand, and on his couch is a white rabbit. And the white rabbit is saying to Sigmund, I don't know where the eggs come from, and I have no idea why I feel a compulsion to hide them. Now, that is an example, again, of the incongruity theory. However, Freud himself developed the relief theory of humor, and more about that later. And now the poem. And this is by Gerald Lachlan. It's called I've Always Enjoyed Her Sense of Humor. She's an old friend, and I don't see her very often. But she has a way of turning up when I'm talking to a girl I've just met. And she will invariably storm up to me and confront me with, "Where's the child support check?" Then turn on her heel and storm from the room, leaving me to make inadequate explanations. Now, that's not my kind of sense of humor, and it may not be yours either, but apparently it is the poet, and he still does love her. It could be an example of benign violation theory. More on that later. In my family, we have a saying, if you have to tell us something's funny, then it isn't. So you've been in that situation, right? Where somebody in your family, a friend, tells a joke, says something, and you all kind of look at each other embarrassed, and the person, my husband, says, "Come on, that was funny." And the whole family chimes in, if you have to say it's funny, it's not. But I gotta say, we really do value good humor, and not just the ice cream. We really do value somebody who can get a zinger in there, even if it's at our own expense, and we'll always say, "Good one, all right." So from a very young age, our children learned that the best way to get praise from their parents was to tell a really good joke. Now, I think all of you know we went through an evolution, not only as a species in terms of our humor, and I'll get into that, but also in terms of our personal development. So often it starts off with a knock-knock joke. So I heard Ada this morning running in the hallway saying, "I'm not a baby anymore, I'm not a baby anymore, I'm a big girl." So I'm just wondering, is she starting to tell jokes? Because knock-knock jokes often come first, maybe Oberon is, And my daughter, because she loves elephants, really loved elephant jokes, which get old fast. So anyway, I think not everyone has a sense of humor. Or let's put it this way, not everyone has a similar sense of humor or understands different senses of humor. So when I'm interviewing wedding couples, I always listen for their laughter. And if they don't share a sense of humor and laugh at each other's jokes, or at least appreciate that the other one has a sense of humor, then I really worry. Because how can a relationship work if you can't laugh together? Even if, like some spouses, like mine, tells puns, and you groan together. So, laughing, groaning, it's all about recognizing that sense of humor. But it's true for all the ceremonies that I do. All the life passage ceremonies contain an element of humor. Even memorial services. And those of you who have attended memorial services that I have officiated probably have recognized this. And this is from Maureen Killeran. And I start all memorial services with this. We come together from the diversity of our grieving to gather in the warmth of this community, giving stubborn witness to our belief that in times of sadness, there is room for laughter. In times of darkness, there always will be light. May we hold fast to the conviction that what we do with our lives matters and that a caring world is possible after all. And there is laughter in every memorial service I have ever officiated. And that kind of speaks, I think, to one of the theories I'll get into that Freud liked called relief theory, about releasing that tension. But before I do that, let me start back at the beginning in terms of how every family has a sense of humor, every culture, every tribe, and every language, every social clique, every workplace, every congregation has a sense of humor. I know one thing that we often say here, because it's a challenge for us to start on time, we kind of turn to each other and say, well, that's ethical culture time. But as it turns out, I found out that every community pretty much says that. So there's something about starting on time that is both, a challenge, but also a source of humor for people. Unless, of course, you're the one who gets there early and you're impatient with everyone else. Think about those situations that we all have in our groups, and really, that's what a sitcom is all about, right? It's a situation comedy where you are invited in as a viewer to participate in that particular sense of humor. And if you like it, you stick with that sitcom, and maybe you stick with it for years. If you don't like it, then you turn away, maybe you look for something else, maybe you look for humor elsewhere. But the premise of a situation comedy is that it sets up in a particular, it wouldn't be funny in any other context, only in that context. Well, E.B. Wright, in every article that I read, and I told you I've been collecting articles for years, but in every article that I read, they all quoted E.B. White. Now, I love E.B. White. Who doesn't love Charlotte's Web? But this is one thing he said that they all quoted. Analyzing humor is like dissecting a frog. Few people are interested, and the frog dies. Nonetheless, every writer continued to analyze humor, and I'm going to do that too. So here are a couple of theories, just because I think they're interesting. And because we're a thinking bunch, so I think it will appeal to you. So from ancient Greece until the 20th century, the vast majority of philosophical comments, because after all, we're also a philosophical movement and we like our philosophers, they say focused on scornful or mocking laughter, or on laughter that overpowers people, rather than on comedy, wit, or joking. And Plato, who was probably one of the most influential critics of laughter, treated it as an emotion that overrides rational self-control. In the Republic, he says that the guardians of the state should avoid laughter, For ordinarily, when one abandons himself to violent laughter, his condition provokes a violent reaction. What really ticked him off, Plato, was passages from the Iliad and the Odyssey, where Mount Olympus was said to ring with the laughter of the gods. He protested that if anyone represents men of worth as overpowered by laughter, we must not accept it, much less if gods. So, following from that, the Stoics also didn't think a whole lot about humor. Their emphasis was on self-control, and they agreed with Plato that laughter diminishes self-control. Epictetus advises, "Let not your laughter be loud, frequent, or unrestrained," and his followers acknowledged that he never laughed at all. Now, I know some of you are taking Massimo's Stoic class, and I know Massimo has a wonderful sense of humor, so I hope that he's not following the Stoics' tradition there. So these objections to laughter and to humor influenced early Christian thinkers, and throughout the later European culture. They were reinforced by kind of a negative representation of laughter and humor in the Bible. Think about the prophets. They certainly did not have a sense of humor. So this kind of Christian European rejection of laughter and humor continued through the Middle Ages, and the reformers reformed everything except the attitude towards humor. And when the Puritans came here, they were certainly not a funny bunch. But we can take, I think we can take some relief, or not relief, but some solace in other cultures, which I'm not going to get into now. That's probably a topic for another platform. But fortunately, not all cultures were as dour as the Puritans and the Christians. But I think they had a point in as much as they were pointing out that often humor and laughter is at the expense of another person. And so, the first theory of humor that was developed was called the superiority theory. And this was one that was proposed by Plato, Aristotle, Hobbes, Descartes. And what it basically says, I think it speaks for itself. Simply put, our laughter expresses feelings of superiority over other people or over a former state of ourselves. And a current proponent of this theory, Roger Scruton, says he analyzes amusement as an attentive demolition of a person or something connected with a person. Okay, so theories are good. Here's another theory. And that's the one that Sigmund Freud liked a lot, and that's called the relief theory, of the pressure valve for repressive psychic energy. So it's kind of like a hydraulic explanation in which laughter does in the nervous system what the pressure relief valve does in a steam boiler. And it was originally sketched out by Lord Shaftesbury in 1709 in an essay on the freedom of wit and humor. And his explanation of laughter is that it releases, get this, it releases animal spirits that have built up pressure inside the nerves. This was, after all, 1709. Then we get to John Dewey, and we love John Dewey because, as one of my colleagues once said about how ethical culture's philosophy evolved from an ethical idealism into humanism, you have forsaken your father Felix Adler for your stepfather John Dewey, who was a humanist. So what he said, along the lines of the relief theory, is that laughter marks the end of a period of suspense or expectation. It's a sudden relaxation of strain, so far as occurring through the medium of the breathing and vocal apparatus. The laugh is thus a phenomenon of the same general kind as a sigh of relief. Well, getting back to Freud, he wrote in Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious in 1905 that there are three laughter situations. One is the joke, the other the comic, and the other humor. And in all three, laughter releases nervous energy that was summoned for a psychological task, but then became superfluous as that task was abandoned. Okay, another theory. Let's move on. Incongruity. Now, incongruity, I think, is one that most of us are familiar with today because that's really what most stand-up comedians use, right? And so while the superiority theory says that the cause of laughter is feelings of superiority, and the relief theory says it's a release of nervous energy, the incongruity theory says it is the perception of something incongruous, something that violates our mental patterns and expectations. And this approach was taken by another philosopher that we like, Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant influenced Felix Adler a great deal because he's the one who talked about ethics in terms of we are ends unto ourselves and not a means to someone else's ends. And just another note about Immanuel Kant. In this room a couple of weeks ago, I had the great pleasure of welcoming an honors ethics class from Monroe College in the Bronx. I loved it. We were being discovered. When ethics classes Google, they find us, and they come here for field trips. So this is like my third field trip with a college class. And so when I mentioned Immanuel Kant as being someone who influenced Felix Adler, they all started to giggle. I said, what, you know Kant? Do we know Kant? We call him Manny. So they, and he's a pretty dense philosopher, so I really appreciated, their attempt to get close to him and to learn more about him. So Immanuel Kant says that that had an explanation of laughter as jokes and wit that involved incongruity. In everything that is to excite a lively, convulsive laugh, there must be something absurd. Of course, we know that from the existentialists, don't we? Camus loved the absurd. So this is what he points out, and Kant insists we must note well that it, that is our expectation, does not transform itself into the positive opposite of an expected object, but it must be transformed into nothing. And here's his joke, Immanuel Kant, 1790. The heir of a rich relative wished to arrange for an imposing funeral, but he lamented that he could not properly succeed. For, said he, the more money I give my mourners to look sad, the more cheerful they look. Immanuel Kant with his zingers. Another way of looking at humor is just as play. It's playful, it's fun. We do it when we're very young, and we should continue doing it all our lives. Just playfulness. In 1999, Ted Cohen wrote about the social benefits of joke telling, and many psychologists confirmed the Catholic Thomas Aquinas' assessment of humor as virtuous. So right now we're getting into the area of ethics. It is considered virtuous. A chapter in the American Psychological Association's Character Strengths and Virtues, a handbook and classification, lists under Strengths of Transcendence, humor, playfulness. It's a strength of transcendence. Even the psychologists believe it. Engaging in humor, it says, can foster a tolerance for ambiguity and diversity and promote creative problem solving. It can serve as a social lubricant, engendering trust and reducing conflict. In communications that tend to evoke negative emotions, announcing bad news, apologizing, complaining, warning, criticizing, commanding, evaluating, humor can provide delight that reduces or even blocks negative emotions. So that reminds me of one of my favorite ethical culture leaders whom I never met. There are quite a few of them, Dr. Henry Newman. And if you've been in my office, you know I have a photograph of him. He's smoking a pipe. A lot of those early leaders smoked pipes. John Lovejoy Elliott also did, and he was known to put the pipe in his pocket and continue talking, and then someone would see smoke coming out of his pocket, and he would pat it down, and he says, well, I guess I'm really on fire today. Yeah, so anyway. Well, Dr. Henry Newman at one point became the head of the Fraternity of Ethical Culture Leaders. Yes, before I came here as a paid professional leader, There were no men. There were no men. There were only men. Only men. I was the first woman who was paid. Anyway, so he would come into the Fraternity of Ethical Culture Leaders, and there was always some mishigas going on. There was always some tension, too much testosterone in the room, I don't know. But Dr. Newman knew that he had to cut through it somehow. So, and I learned this from Rose Walker. Many of you know Rose Walker. She lived to 104, had the most magnificent hats. Bella Absuk had nothing on her. And she said that one of the things that she often did was that her husband and Dr. Newman would get together to try out jokes on each other. And when they found a good one, they would ask her to type them up on 3x5 cards. So when Dr. Newman came here for one of those meetings, he had a stack of cards. And when the guys were going at it at the meeting, he'd just pull out one of those and he'd tell a joke. Now, I wonder, if maybe a different process would have worked better. Maybe they could have done like an opening go-around like we do now and discussed their feelings and why they had this tension. But that never would have worked for Dr. Newman. He would just, pull out another 3x5 card. So I like that a lot. I like that notion of it being healthy. It's just a really healthy thing, which leads to another theory. And this one is called the benign violation theory. And apparently it's the hottest theory these days, although it gives incongruity a run for its money. So at the University of Southern California, they provide students, get this, a concentration in humor. The University of Colorado has a humor research laboratory. The International Society for Humor Studies, and they publish humor, the International Journal of Humor. This is true. And they publish a lot. And when you get a PhD, you have to write a dissertation that's unique, that nobody else has written about. So I think they opened up this whole field of humor just because everything else was played out. And that's why they're doing this. So two of them are Peter McGraw and Joel Warner, and they wrote the Humor Code, a global search for what makes things funny. So McGraw is the director of this humor research lab. And he came up with a theory called benign violation theory. It holds that humor only occurs when something seems wrong, unsettling, or threatening, in other words, a violation, but simultaneously seems okay, acceptable, or kind of safe. And so this form takes place in most jokes and comic situations where, with the threat of a violation of some sort, and that the uneasiness is saved by a kind of a benign end. And so he gives an example. A man and woman are necking passionately on their banquette in a French restaurant when suddenly the woman slides under the table. A moment or two later, the waiter approaches the table and informs the man that his wife is missing, to which he replies, "No, she's not. She just walked in the door." Ba-bum. So relief follows that it's not the joke you thought it was going to be, but it became something else. So he calls that the benign violation one. Now, Bob Menkoff, I know a lot of you read The New Yorker. And if you're anything like me, the first thing I do is look at all the cartoons. Cartoons come first. So Bob Menkoff, the cartoon editor of The New Yorker, told McGraw and Warner that to be merely funny is insufficient for a cartoon to qualify for The New Yorker. He says, a great New Yorker cartoon must also have a point, provide an insight, must have an aha moment alongside the ha-ha one. So so there was some episode on Seinfeld where they were trying to get at the essence of a New Yorker cartoon and using it, sadly, as a measure of how smart someone is. So that would be an example of the superiority theory if you didn't get the New Yorker joke and you made fun of people. Anyway, the ultimate takeaway of all of this is sort of that the evolutionary purpose of laughter and amusement is to signal to the world that a violation is okay. McGraw says organisms that could separate benign violations from real threats benefited greatly. So that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, we have that, the amygdala with the, fight, flight, freeze piece. So if we can sort of tolerate a violation and have it turn into something benign, then it seems like it might be a psychologically healthy thing. Well, as you can imagine, there are some detractors from this theory, and as one person, Victor Raskin, who's the founder of the academic journal, Humor International Journal, I love this one. It's an academic journal called Humor International Journal of Humor Research. So he's more blunt, and he says about this benign violation, what McGraw has come up with is flawed and bullshit. What kind of theory is that? He says it's very loose, it's a vague metaphor, and he says McGraw doesn't have any standing in the tight-knit community of scholarship. He is not a humor researcher. He has no status. Which I actually think is pretty funny. I mean, really, he has no status as a humor researcher. Anyway. So in another article I read in The Atlantic about what makes something funny, I learned that while the average adult laughs 18 times a day, laughter isn't a reliable indicator. Researchers found only 10 to 20% of remarks that prompted laughter to be remotely funny. So you got to wonder, how they're measuring that, what kind of scale they have on that. But it is something about this evolutionary adaptation that has promoted human survival by rewarding our relatively feeble minds for distinguishing between true from false, right from wrong, harmless from dangerous, over countless harrowing and deeply confusing centuries. Well, the comedians that I like the best, that I enjoy the best, that I come back to over and over again, have one word in common, and that's truth. They tell the truth. And it's something about educating. It's not just, the humor about, am I smart enough to get that benign violation theory or that incongruity? But am I also hearing something that's the truth? So I think about Dick Gregory, for example. He underscored what was wrong and then he satirized it. One person called Dick Gregory the Marvin Gaye of comedy. What's going on? What's going on, right? He always looked at what's going on. And he brought this withering truth to the attention of everyone, right? And what's also so interesting about Dick Gregory is that if you look at the history of black comedy, so often it was insular, right? I mentioned before it's about a tribe, it's about a group. So much of black humor was by and for and about black people. Dick Gregory crossed that line. As he said, I got to sit on Jack Parr's couch. And that didn't happen often, ever. He was the first black comedian to sit on Jack Parr's couch. And those of you who don't know Jack Parr, he was the first one to start The Tonight Show, and just a brilliantly funny guy and a mensch, really just a wonderful guy. And here's an example of Gregory's humor. So he's sitting, he's done his routine, very funny, and white people love it, they get it. He sits down on the couch, they're chatting, and so Jack says, so, Dick, what kind of car do you drive? And he looks at me and he says, a Lincoln, of course. And it's just, so anyway. So part of what follows, obviously, he really inspired so many people. Chris Rock, I love Chris Rock. He's a preacher. He tells it like it is. He examines the human condition and he brings it to light, and he's always educating people. There's never a false note. It's true. It's all true. So to get into another kind of, we know that there's different ethnic humor. So Jewish comics are very well known and tell a lot of jokes, and also of the incongruity type. A lot of them are stand-up comedians. But often it can be isolating, and I'll give you an example from my own life. Many years ago, my husband and I and another couple went to the Catskills. We went to Grossinger's. And why did we go? Well, the food is good. And Milton Berle was performing. Who doesn't want to see Milton Berle? So Milton Berle, of course, slapstick, often dressed in women's clothing. But what he also was known for was giving the punchlines in Yiddish. And so at one point in his routine, he looks out in the audience and he says that he's now going to speak Yiddish so dass die Kinder nicht verstehen, so that the children don't understand. Bear in mind, I'm the only goy in this group, but I had 2 years that I lived in Germany, so I know what he's saying. So I think, what? And I said, that's okay. That's okay, Kindle. You don't need to know. But part of that came out of also the sense that the language. Think about humor for survival. So I mentioned Dick Gregory, Richie Pryor, we know, Chris Rock. A lot of that humor was about how do we survive the circumstances in which we live. Well, Jews did that remarkably well. I mean, you could be, the Cossacks could be at the door, and you could still tell a joke. You could still use a kind of an inflection with your voice. And a lot of that, so much of that was about survival, because if anyone heard you say those words or saw them written out, they would look benign. But if you tell it with an accent, it's a whole other thing, or an inflection. So I watched a few documentaries, and one that I would highly recommend, although it's difficult to get the whole thing, was on PBS and on Independent Lens. It was called The Last Laugh. And comedians are talking about, can you make jokes about the Holocaust? And so one woman was talking about her mother. She says, my mother, she laughed all the time, and she'd say, what, I survived Hitler, so you don't make your bed? So, I mean, just taking all these kinds of, and the survival of it, the saying, he's not going to get me down. So in one of the clips, this woman is saying, I'm here, I'm alive. I have 3 beautiful great-grandchildren, and Hitler's dead. I won. So there's this whole sense of survival. I know that probably, I'm guessing, that maybe Sarah Silverman isn't everyone's cup of tea, but I like her very, very much. And this is an example. One of the things that she said that I think is so true, and again, it speaks to the truth of humor. She said, it's important to talk about things that are taboo. Otherwise, they just stay in this dark place and they become dangerous. Here's an example of one of her Holocaust jokes. So, she said, so one of her jokes has a lesbian niece report to her that in Hebrew school, they learned that they killed 60 million Jews during the Holocaust. Sarah corrects the niece by saying that it was only 6 million. What's the difference, the niece asks. The difference, Silverman replies, is 60 million is unforgivable, young lady. These jokes, notice, it's kind of the reverse, benign violation formula, because that kind of ends up in a full flame violation. But, in a way, it gives that kind of relief. And there was a play recently here, Standing Up, where the character in the play is in a setting about 9/11. And it tells a joke about 9/11 it was about health insurance. Well, at least we don't need this health insurance anymore. And the other people in the support circle are aghast, and some of them walk out. But others turn to him and say, thank you, I really needed that. We really need, in times of tragedy, the opportunity to laugh. There's another documentary that I highly recommend, and a little easier to get than the Independent Lens one. It's called Comedy Warriors, Healing Through Humor. I think we'll show it here someday. It is so good. And what it does, it takes 5 severely wounded Iraq-Afghanistan veterans who were given the opportunity to explore their experiences through the healing power of humor. And one of them you may have seen before because he's actually out on the comedy circuit these days. He's a gentleman who served in Iraq during the Desert Storm, the first one, and then came back in Afghanistan, and his face was burned badly. And so some of you have heard him, right? And he said, I could have come back, and he said, I considered suicide. He said, but I'm married. I have children. I have to do something for my comrades who died. And so he goes out there and he tells the most hilarious jokes. And some of them, refer to his face, and how people will look at him. And he says, one of his friends said that after a performance, he will stick around an hour later because people come up to him and tell him their stories. This is what happened in my life, and this is how humor helped me. And thank you so very much. An example of one of their jokes. So, a paraplegic, he'd lost both of his legs, and he's in a store. And in front of him, he sees a guy who's got a cast on his arm, and he's kind of getting in there, he's scratching, he goes, he says, this is I hate this. And so, the guy behind him who's lost both legs says, oh yeah, bro, I can see how rough that is. And he looks down. And so then he hears a voice behind him. And he looks around and there's a quadriplegic. And he goes, yeah, right on, bro, I see how tough it is for you. And then he hears a voice behind him. And it's a head in a jar. I don't know how it got there, but there it was saying, yeah, bro, real rough. But this was a joke told by somebody who went through as some of the comics who helped them with this. I mean, they had top comics listening to them, helping them write them, rehearsing with them, and they said, you have been to hell and back, and you've got this sense of humor. And it's helping all of us so much. And a lot of it is the pain. And they say, we still have a lot of physical pain. But one of the women who was there, because of the pain, became an addict. She took Oxycontin, she became an addict. She got off it and she became pregnant. So she's on the stage pregnant, telling her jokes. And afterwards she said, this is a whole new kind of narcotic, humor. I know the pain is there, I feel it, but I don't care so much. So the kind of healing that they went through for themselves, the kind of healing they give others, is so inspiring. I highly recommend you see that, and I will show it here as well. Well, to wind it all up, I said before that every family has its kind of humor, and so you know that my dad died in January. So he was coming in and out of consciousness. And at one point, somebody popped in the room just to see how he was doing. And my dad popped up. He sat upright. And he said, Bill Klaeysen, Klaeysen. And of course, the guy at the door who didn't know him was stunned. But my sister and cousins just burst out laughing because it's the craziest spelling of a name for that pronunciation. And so it was just hilarious that he did that. So before the closing poem, I want to thank Michelle and Jennifer. As you know, our court jesters today, the court jesters who speak truth to power, are having a heyday. And thank goodness they are, because there's just so much chocolate and red wine I can consume, and it's really not helping with Trump at all. But I'll tell you, John Oliver, Trevor Noah, Samantha Bee, I'm so very grateful for them. So I know some of you recognize this book. So this is A Day in the Life of Marlon Bundo. And this came out because a very mean and nasty person who happens to be our vice president hates lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgenders. Hates them. You heard Trump. He said, oh, if he had his way, he'd hang them all. That was kind of not a benign violation joke. I think that was anyway. So Pence wrote his wife wrote it, his daughter illustrated a book about their bunny rabbit, because that's their pet. They don't have a dog, they don't have a cat, they have a bunny rabbit. And so John Oliver, to sort of heal people who were so hurt by Pence, and in that show, he went in deep. I mean, we knew that Pence was bad, but you know, Oliver has a research team that really digs in. It's reprehensible, the kind of things that he says about other human beings. It's hateful, it's cruel, and it should not be allowed. So what does John Oliver do? He writes a book. He writes a book about two gay rabbits who love each other and get married. And this is kind of looks like Pence. It's called The Stinky Bug. So they want to get married. This is the bunny I love. Too bad, said the stink bug. I'm the stinkiest and I am important. I'm the stinkiest and I'm in charge. Boy bunnies marry girl bunnies. Girl bunnies marry boy bunnies. This is the way it has always been. You are different, and different is bad. So it has a happy ending and is out. Thank you so much for sharing this, ladies. And as you know, he said it's also a really good book for children. It works in so many different ways. So Sharon Olds wrote a poem called Diagnosis. By the time I was 6 months old, she knew something was wrong with me. I got looks on my face she had not seen on any child in the family, or the extended family, or the neighborhood. My mother took me into the pediatrician with a kind hands, a doctor with a name like a suit size for a wheel. Hub Long. My mother did not tell him what she thought, in truth, that I was possessed. It was just these strange looks on my face. He held me and conversed with me, chatting as one does with a baby, and my mother said, "She's doing it now. Look, she's doing it now." And the doctor said, "What your daughter has is called a sense of humor." "Oh," she said, and took me back to the house where that sense of humor would be tested and found to be incurable. Thank you.